If you went to see the movie Thor: Love and Thunder and stayed in your seat past the credits, you were introduced to a new character in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a bare-chested Hercules, played by actor Brett Goldstein from the show Ted Lasso. Goldstein's Hercules was plucked directly from the pages of Marvel comic books, where he's been seen on and off since Stan Lee and Jack Kirby first created him in a 1964 issue of The Avengers. Lee and Kirby, of course, based their character on the ancient Greek myths of Heracles, whose 12 legendary labors included killing the monstrous Hydra, overpowering the three-headed canine guard of the underworld, and cleaning out some very nasty stables. And the Greeks' Heracles may be an evolution of Paleolithic myths told in hunting societies over 10,000 years ago, as suggested by his iconic animal skin cloak and club. All of which begs the question, why are we still telling stories about this guy? Now, I am a sucker for an ancient story. The ancienter, the better. I remember as a kid finding a copy of D'Aulaire's book of Greek myths in my elementary school library. I was fascinated by the brightly colored illustrations of gods and heroes and monsters. And I would copy out the drawings in the margins of my notebooks. While the Greeks were my gateway drug, I expanded my palette as I got older to include myths, legends, folk, and fairy tales from around the world. I was particularly drawn to stories about tricksters, like the Native American coyote or the West African Spider-Man Anansi. Tricksters were smart and cunning. Their tricks could be hilarious or mean-spirited, or both. They poked their thumbs in the eyes of those in authority and introduced a bit of chaos into the ordered world. As a socially anxious child, perhaps I wanted to be just a bit more like them. For me, reading these ancient stories feels almost like time travel. When I'm laughing at the antics of Anansi or tensing up as the crew in the Odyssey is eaten by the Cyclops, I am sharing an emotional experience with long-dead listeners hundreds or even thousands of years ago. What is it about these stories that keeps them alive? Told and retold down the generations, while so many others have dissipated into the cultural void. I like to think that it's because these stories still have things to teach us, that they illuminate something important about the world and about ourselves, that these stories are, in a sense, true. I don't know about you, but that is not what I was taught. When I was young, I learned that ancient myths were just humans grasping naive efforts to make sense of a confusing world in the days before science. Lightning and thunder were mysterious to early humans, so people assumed they were produced by a hot-headed deity. Voila! Thor, Indra, Shango, Jupiter, and all the other thunder gods were born. But we have science now. We understand how lightning is produced not by gods, but through electrostatic discharges in the clouds. Well, I don't personally understand it, but presumably someone does. So we no longer need our thunder gods. We can safely relegate them to the realm of entertainment. We can laugh as Thor and his ragtag crew of guardians tour the galaxy. Today, the word myth is just another word for lie. It took me a while to realize that this snobbish take on mythology completely misses the point. British author and former nun Karen Armstrong has been a big influence on me here. In her book, A Short History of Myth, Armstrong argues, it is a mistake to regard myth as an inferior mode of thought, which can be cast aside when human beings have attained the age of reason. Mythology is not an early attempt at history and does not claim that its tales are objective fact. Instead, she says, a myth is essentially a guide. It tells us what we must do in order to live more richly. I love that. In order to live more richly. So stories of heroes traveling to the underworld prepare us to face death, and in doing so, find new meaning in life. Trickster stories offer a model of resistance to authority while highlighting the dangers of greed and hubris. Stories of the universe's creation remind us of the need for creativity as we build this world together day by day. By this logic, stories survive because their lessons remain relevant. To be honest, I find it a bit humbling to read these stories and see how closely the concerns of ancient peoples resemble our own. These are stories about love and loss, pride and jealousy, war and peace, family and community. Despite our modern myths of progress, we are not so different from our ancient ancestors. That said, sometimes things change so much that a story's lesson is no longer helpful, and at that point, the story dies out, or it may evolve. That, I think, is the true superpower of these stories, that they have been able to evolve over time and across cultures while retaining their core truths. Researchers in the field of phylogenetics study this evolution with the same tools they use to study plant and animal evolution. They draw elaborate family trees that track the evolution of a certain type of story. For example, they've tracked how dragon stories began in Africa and evolved alongside Homo sapiens as we spread across the globe. Just like with genetic evolution, stories evolve through small mutations. Each story tells it a bit differently, depending on who they are, who their audience is, and the times that they are living in. Some of these mutations are evolutionary dead ends. Maybe the storyteller tries something new and gets booed, and tomatoes are thrown, and they decide they are not going to try that version again. Other mutations catch on and spread. It's a millennia-long lineage of fan fiction and reboots. Now, this is not necessarily a smooth process. It can be messy and even violent. And as we know from today, people with access to power often try to control what stories get heard, where, and how. Consider fairy tales. Many of the fairy tales we know today, like Snow White, Rapunzel, or Cinderella, evolved over thousands of years in Germany's oral storytelling traditions. The young Grimm brothers decided to start collecting and preserving these stories, worried that this important piece of German culture would be lost. At first, their stories remained very faithful to the versions that they had heard. But then, under pressure from churches and parents, the Grimms edited their tales to make them more acceptable to Victorian sensibilities and Christian teachings. These mass-produced Christianized versions quickly became the dominant versions of these stories, at least until Disney got a hold of them and transformed them once again. Or consider the countless stories that have been intentionally erased. I'm thinking here of the ultimately unsuccessful but still disastrous attempts to wipe out the cultures of enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples in the Americas. We will never know what truths about the world, what hard-won knowledge, what guidance for living richly was lost in these genocidal campaigns. But stories are slippery things. Enslaved Africans kept their oral traditions and religions alive through secrecy, stealth, and adaptation. The West African trickster transformed in this new land into Brer Rabbit, star of the Uncle Remus stories. The thunder god Shango found new form in the pantheon of Santeria, which blended African religions with Catholicism. Meanwhile, indigenous storytellers sustained their traditions outside of the colonial systems and now are working to bridge the cultural gaps left by the Indian boarding schools by teaching their languages and stories to a new generation. Today, ancient stories are all around us. They live on in Disney remakes and children's books, in holiday pageants and religious rituals, in the minds of storytellers and the recordings of academics. We have inherited a bounty of knowledge, history, and guidance for living richly. So I guess the question is, what are we going to do with it? How will we play out our role in this age-old game of telephone? I think it starts with listening. Listen closely to these stories, even if you've heard them a million times and think you know them. Listen for the wisdom, the common humanity buried inside. And when you find it, share it. Be a co-author of these collective narratives. Keep the parts you believe. Set aside the parts that are no longer useful. Add your personal spin and interpretation. And if you are open enough, vulnerable enough, these stories just might change you as they move through you into the future.